Okay, we're in the home stretch. Just one announcement before we start this last panel. You know, there's such a demand for knowledge, there's such a demand for education, there's such a demand for this type of dialogue that we are planning, and it's in the planning stages, to actually have an event in Latin America. And the site that has been chosen, and Jose Luis is clapping, is Mexico. What a coincidence. And it will be a financial crime conference, and we're joining with HSBC, that of course has a very large presence in Mexico and has their financial crime threat mitigation people there. So we're going to put that together. We'll talk about the things, some of the things we've talked about here, the ideas of the data sharing, the fintech, the reg tech, trade-based money laundering. So be ready for more information on that, but it will be coming in 2019. So now, you know, every year we invite a rock star to moderate one of our closing panels. He says he's not a rock star, but once he comes in the front door of the hotel, it takes him about 2 hours to get to the check-in desk. And you all know how short a distance that is. So we've had this theme, public-private partnerships, regulatory reform. So now we've assembled a great panel. Hi, Sarah. You ready for this? Regulatory reform. Sarah's going to tell us all how she supports regulatory reform, and all of it in favor of the industry. So this is going to be a great thing. So I'm going to turn it over to the Ayatollah of rock and roll, Chip Poncy.
Thank you, David. I'm not sure if oh, you can hear me. Great.
Oh, God.
It is fantastic to be back at FIBA. And the only problem with FIBA is that there isn't enough time, because it feels like a reunion. And every year, the family gets bigger, and there's less time to meet with more people. Every year, the mission becomes more important. It becomes more complicated. And it requires us to spend more than 2 days together. So I'm going to urge David next year to take a 2-day conference and turn it into a week. That's my recommendation. I'm just going to go right to the close. It's been a great 2 days, and it's a huge honor to be closing this out in the afternoon today with the opportunity to introduce a great topic and a great panel. Having heard the discussions over the last 8.5 with you all, there's no doubt BSA and regulatory reform is top of mind, not only for those of us here and for the institutions and agencies where we work, the countries where we come from, but in Washington, in the Congress, and globally. There is a sense that this mission that we have, while it has become more important than ever, also has huge opportunities for improvement. So we're going to spend some time talking about that today. And you've got 4 fabulous panelists here to do that. I'm going to start with Ryan and Clay. Ryan is a partner at Baker McKenzie and a former prosecutor with a storied career at DOJ. It's a pleasure to have him on the panel. Clay Porter is also a former prosecutor from DOJ, now a managing director at Navigant. And I have to say this, I like Clay, but I love his mom, because his mom is a big AML fan. And speaking of which, I want to thank David for allowing me to do the Bring Your Mom to Work Day. My mom is down here. Marnie Poncy. Great to have you here, Mom. Thank you. We also have Sarah Runge, who I think is, from the government side, the singular person most responsible for the conversation that we've been having all week. Sarah has spent the last 10 years building bridges globally, across industry and government, across industries themselves, and has been central to the policy discussions that have been the centerpiece of this forum for the past 10 years, whether it's CDD, information sharing technology, the risk-based approach, and I'm sure she's going to have a lot to say. Guillermo Horta is the true rock star of the bridge between Latin America and Washington. Those of you who have been coming here know that Guillermo was a little out of breath coming up here because he was coming from 5 other panels that he was on at the same time. I'm not sure how he does that. But the man who's in highest demand at these conferences every year is Guillermo, for a great reason. And you can always count on Guillermo to find a solution to complex problems, bringing people together. So that's our panel. We have 5 organizing principles. Andrea, I don't know if we can get the slide up. But if we can go to the slide deck, what we thought we would do is take the topic of BSA and regulatory reform, which means a lot of different things to different people, and break this down into 5 discussion points or organizing principles that you see before you. And the format that we're going to use is to give each of our panelists 5 minutes or so to provide some opening comments or thoughts around what BSA and regulatory reform, what that means, why it's important, and what we should be doing. We'll then have a discussion around these principles up here on the panel, and then we'll turn it over to you for Q&A. So take notes, think of the good questions, and we'll come back to you in about 35 minutes or so. With that, why don't we kick it off? Ryan, you're up.
Well, thank you very much, Chip, and thank you all for having me here. As Chip mentioned, I spent most of my career at the U.S. Department of Justice, and in fact, the core of my work there, and later I led efforts on primarily sanctions and export control enforcement. And so at the risk of all of you wondering why I'm not on the next panel, I'll tell you why. And the reason is I thought this was an excellent forum to bring sort of a practical perspective to the conversation we're about to have. I'm not a policy lawyer, but I have lived with the practical implications of you all being on the front lines of U.S. enforcement, primarily of sanctions. Obviously, money laundering and anti-money laundering programs address other risks. But what you face in the future has everything to do with your efforts on the front lines and the U.S. Government's recognition that its use of the financial system to really try to incentivize conduct that occasionally happens from far away has everything to do with the enforcement priorities and the modernization of this act moving into the future. And so while my path here today is an indirect one, it's not entirely an unpredictable one. It has everything to do with the history of sanctions enforcement over the course of the past 10 years. It started out, as I should say, as Chip and some of his former colleagues at the Treasury Department building in an infrastructure to think a little bit more deeply and thoughtfully post 9/11 about the way we can use the world's financial system to get at illicit conduct, beginning with terrorist financing, and then subsequent to that, efforts to really give teeth to the Treasury Department's SDN program to address weapons proliferation. And where we are from there, you'll recall, Iran. I love the Superman reference. It's still that way here in America. Superman reference. Iran to U.S. persons, to U.S. dollars, it's kryptonite. Cuba, same. North Korea, same. But everything has changed as a result of that, as a result of our efforts at the Justice Department, at the Treasury Department, and many other agencies looking to focus on what I call trade facilitators over the years. We don't have to put our hands on somebody in Iran who's building missiles or somebody who's building bombs or IEDs. We have to attack the infrastructure that allows that conduct to exist. If you think about any sophisticated criminal enterprise, it always depends upon a not entirely illegitimate infrastructure. You need financing, you need freight, you need other types of facilitators, and if you focus your efforts on them as a government enforcement agency, you incentivize better behavior, better diligence, better compliance. And there was that huge recognition, largely as a result, Clay will talk about it, I'm sure, as well, of his section. We used to work with the anti-money laundering section at DOJ to get at some of the sanctions conduct that mostly European banks were engaged in, stripping conduct, so to speak, deleting references to sanctioned countries to allow for correspondent banking relationships to really flourish and allow for the clearing of US dollars in New York City. As a result of those efforts, the huge focus came in on banks. That means, again, thank you for your service. You're on the front lines. You're out in front of every US law enforcement agency, the Justice Department, and more. So it has everything to do with what we're about to talk about in the future here. Just to preview that from my perspective, again, not as a policy lawyer, but just as someone who's seen increasingly the overlap between OFAC and increasingly FinCEN really sort of jumping out in front, starting to use 311 authorities, really bringing about change to their great credit. It's not Donald Trump's skills as a negotiator or his charisma that's bringing North Korea to the table. It's absolutely the focus, from a sanctions perspective in particular, putting a focus on Chinese banks, the threat of secondary sanctions, that's really for the first time, North Korea has been isolated, but they are truly, truly isolated now because they can't get the assistance of Chinese banks, and increasingly, I think, probably Russian banks are next. So that's what we have to think about in the future. So just to preview the conversation I hope we have, and I certainly would love to have any questions from you as we go along just regarding my perspective, I think what I'd like to see as a result of the efforts to reform this act are more consistency around federal and local compliance enforcement mechanisms. There's a lot of discussion around building your compliance program to the examiner rather than to the priority risks and enterprise risks that your financial services organization needs to manage well. I think the same with regard to state regulators and federal regulators. There's a huge amount of inconsistency there. I'd like to see that resolved. Second, I think more than any one matter, the volume of transactions and the cross-border nature of transactions has significantly gone well beyond what this act was intended for. I had the great pleasure last year of traveling on behalf of a client to Pakistan in order to give some good advice and build a compliance program around mobile technology that was moving just huge amounts of money, mobile to mobile, which you can imagine the risks of that in Pakistan. This system is not built for the risks that are there. It can't handle the volume of data. It can't manage it well. And ultimately, at the end of the day, where we are with the limitations on correspondent banking, I get very concerned that the unbanked and underbanked parts of the world are being cut off entirely from the financial system, and it's completely contrary to the foreign policy goals of the United States and our efforts here, which are really twofold. You bring money into the system, and you make it transparent. And if we keep money out of the system, we're going back to sort of, we're keeping entire countries and agrarian states using old and informal ways of banking, koalas and the like. So I hope there'll be some good reform efforts there. Finally, I think it's important for the US government really, and particularly the Treasury Department, there are just excellent, deep, smart people there. There's just not enough of them, and they don't have the resources. And unfortunately, from a law enforcement perspective, they don't have the real deep expertise in order to build in those priorities. I think a stronger enforcement mechanism, a more predictable one, a more prioritized one, actually makes your job easier rather than focusing on the day-to-day SARS about an insider who's stealing money from the bank, which is going to be reported anyway, and instead focus your efforts and resources where they really count. So I hope that helps inform the discussion, and look forward to it very much.
Ryan, thanks so much. Great opening comments, and certainly some issues that we're going to follow up on in the discussion. Clay, your turn.
Thank you for having me today. FIBA is near and dear to my heart, which I'll tell you about in just a moment, but first I need to explain the mom comment. I was chief of the Bank Integrity Unit in the Department of Justice, and I actually have been out of, I forget, 3 months now, so I'm pretty fresh. So if I sound like I'm talking like I'm from the government, I still feel like I'm from the government. I was on my way home late at night, and I got a call from my mom, and she said, Clay, have you seen this guy, Chip Poncy, talking about HSBC? And she didn't know that I was working on HSBC, but she said, do you realize you should talk to him? He has a lot of really good information. I said, Mom, I'll keep that in mind. You can never talk contrary to your mother. So I said, I'll keep that in mind. But I wish I had an opportunity to talk to you about it. The reason FIBA is near and dear to my heart is I was here 2 years ago speaking on a panel. And one of the things I was saying was how compliance, and in the government we used to talk about how compliance officers are really the front line. They're part of law enforcement family in many ways. And I had talked about how I understood that compliance can often be seen as a cost center and sometimes it has a very thankless job and it's very difficult to do your job. And I talked about how important the job was, and I really mean it. I meant it then. The government meant it then. I can't talk for the government anymore. I really didn't at the time, but and I don't have to give that same sort of disclaimer anymore, which is nice. But and at the end of the speech, I had to, or the talk, I had to run out and catch my plane, and I was stopped going down the steps by an unnamed bank compliance officer who said to me, "Thank you so much for saying that. I just got off the phone with a very, very difficult question, a very, very difficult group of folks in my bank who just didn't understand, and that talk you gave me made me feel like I mattered both to the government and to what I was doing." And I kept that with me for years after that, and every speech I gave when I was in the government, I made sure I put that piece there. So I want to say it, I'm not in the government anymore, but I do want to say that's one of the reasons I'm really happy to be here, because I know that we're among family. And to pivot just a little bit, when I left, people asked me, what surprises you the most about your work outside of the government? About what shocked you? Did anything shock you? So a lot of things surprised me. But what really stuck out to me was the fast pace of innovation, the fast pace of cryptocurrency. Certainly in the government, I knew it. I prosecuted those types of things. But now that I'm in the private sector, I'm privy to a lot of more sort of the cutting edge. In the government, you go after it often when things are going bad. You try to be proactive, but it's very difficult to do both at the same time, although Sarah's group does a great job of it. And for me, I thought, wow, this is a new area. This machine learning, cryptocurrency, technology is changing so fast. But what that does is it changes the way money launderers are thinking. It changes the way sanctions evaders are thinking. So the challenge is, how do you guard against those new technologies, but also use them because they can be used for good? And to Ryan's point, the BSA, a lot of the regs and the rules and regulations were built for the telegraph, the telephone, checks. They weren't built for virtual currency. And so that is a struggle that everybody has. And I think the government and compliance, and now I've seen both, are sprinting right now, sprinting to keep up. And when you sprint, you're out of breath. And you don't have time to really step back and go, how is this going to affect my bank overall? How do I change the regulations? And that's why this panel is so important, because you were able to address these issues. And the one thing I'll leave you with on that subject is that things like machine learning, those are really promising areas to look into. I think they will be successful as long as you have quality assurance and independent testing and making sure that what it's doing the right way. But I would also say, to weather this kind of exponential change, compliance has to have a hunger to catch up with and get in front of the bad guys that are trying to use technology and cryptocurrency, which has certainly legitimate uses. But that hunger is what's going to keep you ahead, and is what's going to save, certainly will keep our financial system secure, but also help when you have those interactions with the business folks. So again, it's great to be back here.
Clay, thanks so much. I'm going to hop over Sarah for a moment and get to Guillermo, because Sarah's got the answers to a lot of these questions, but we're going to save her to back cleanup. Guillermo, you're up.
Thanks. So I would start saying that, that.
We
Can we get one of the audience microphones? Thank you. I got you, Guillermo.
You can hear me, right?
Oh,
no.
you good?
Perfect, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so great. So first of all, I would say that this is quite an interesting panel. I hope that we're going to have a hot discussion because it has been, I would say, almost more than 50 years, right? That now we have our regulations enacted, and most of the changes that we have made on our regulations have been only addressing, I would say, partial concerns, right? We have the situations of September 11, then we turn around, creating a little bit of changes, more knowledge on the clients, things of that nature, but we haven't been sitting in front of, I would say, of the industry, regulators, getting together and thinking if what we are doing is the right pathway to actually help law enforcement and help, I would say, international governments in this fight against terrorist financing and I would say, and combating money laundering. The main driver would be, I would say, to start thinking if what we are doing is actually effective, right? That means not only to take a look into what we are reporting is actually useful, the way that we are exchanging information. I think that it's very unfortunate to still have discussions on, I would say, obstacles on information sharing between financial institutions, information sharing with other countries. And when you're talking with the bad guys, right? Or if you talk to the real bad guys, the bad guys are not, playing the same rules as we are playing, right? These guys are really organized. These guys are using technology. These guys are using state-of-the-art communications, but we're still focused on, on reporting CTRs, filing SARs, defensive SARs, right? Making sure that the paper looks beautiful, making sure that the staple is on the paper, making sure that the client, we know every single detail of them, no matter if they are lying to us, right? And it's just, I would say, just almost like a tick-the-box process, right? And unfortunately, I would say that still I have seen a lot of players in the industry that they still play the tick-the-box process. I still see a lot of industries, that are less regulated. I still see some players that are probably subject to a less, I would say, pressure from an examination point of view, right? Probably playing by the same rules, but with a different examination culture. And then I see that, that these rules are basically applied on a basis of making sure that you have a KYC file, on making sure that you buy, I would say, a technological solution that will give you, some monitoring models that will suffice the requirements of the regulation. But we're not truly focusing on what's the risk that I'm posing through the products that I use, through the business and the footprint that I have. So I think it's the right moment to step up and rethink if we're doing the right, I would say we're following the right pathway. I was just participating in a tax evasion panel, right? And one of the, I would say, of the unfortunate consequences of getting more transparent from a tax perspective, right, is that the regulations are still very simple in terms of what we need to obtain from our clients. But then when we were discussing this item, we were saying that you need to do more questions to your clients, right? Asking them if they have different nationalities, asking them if they have different, residences, if they have different tax evasion or tax planning programs, right? So at some point when I was hearing some former colleagues from my previous firm asking what should I do as a banker, I was just thinking, well, they might be completely, blindsided right now, thinking, what else should I be asking my regulators? What else? I'm sorry. What else should I be asking to my clients, right? And the question is almost turning our bankers into investigators, which I don't think that that's the purpose of this situation, right? So how can we use technology? How can we use artificial intelligence? How can we make our systems more assertive? And how can we step out of the defensive SAR filing, right? And the pure, I would say, illogical thinking that I still hear a lot. I'm a broker dealer. There's no money laundering here because I don't receive cash, right? Or I deal only with very well-known clients, right? Which I don't know exactly what they mean by that. But you hear all these stories, and I think that that's what is driving the set completely different. And the final point that I would also like to include is I think that we need to professionalize the compliance, I would say, function. In other words, I think that that is not only about appointing a compliance officer, but making sure that whomever is appointed as a compliance officer has the adequate skills and the adequate experience in regards to law enforcement or to money laundering related activities, right? I would say that today we still suffer the situation, and that's something that the big banks, we suffer constantly, at least on the corresponding banking space. Mm-hmm. You can have a beautiful program, you can have a beautiful copy of the AML policy of the bank, when you sit down in front of the compliance officer, you realize that the compliance officer has zero experience, right? And he's just the ex-auditor that for some reason he didn't want to be an auditor anymore, right? And he found it more sexy to be called compliance officer, right? And he moved to compliance, or you have the ex-lawyer that just decided to join, or you have the ex-general counsel of a local, law enforcement agency with no knowledge on products and services that are offered by the banks, but all of a sudden you just get the badge and you said, you're a compliance officer. And now we see from the enforcement actions that the compliance officers are getting more personal liability, more responsibility in terms of willful blindness, more responsibility on our shoulders. But that, I would say that that's a good point that we need to start working, and I would definitely advocate that FIBA has been one of the most wonderful associations trying to put that balance between what the compliance officer should do and what the law enforcement agencies and regulators are expecting from us. So we'll get that to start.
Fantastic. Thank you, Guillermo. Great thoughts. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Chip, and thanks for the introduction. I should start off by saying that I don't have all the answers, but I'm fortunate enough to work in an office that I get to answer and work with all of you to answer questions. So I think I work in the policy coordination office within the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. I'm a policymaker, I'm not a regulator, and that gives us a unique position as we work with industry and really work to identify and solve complicated problems as it relates to AML CFT. So if anything, I've just been honored to work in an office that has supported our work to really think about big problems and work with all stakeholders to try to solve those problems. So I want to talk about this key issue here about what we mean when we say reg reform. And this has been a key topic that's been talked about this week. And one thing that I have heard people say is they start talking about regulatory relief in the context of regulatory reform. Within the department, that isn't how we're thinking of it. We're thinking of this in the context of making our system more efficient and more effective across the board. So that means for industry, for policymakers, for law enforcement, if the filings and the identification of certain transactions are more effective and efficient, then the whole system works better, right? So that's the umbrella of how we're looking at this. Since Undersecretary Mandelker came into her position last summer, we have a working group within the department. Andrea Sharon at FinCEN has talked about this. She and I co-lead this group. And it is really involved taking a holistic look at the way our system works. And there are some things that are old and some things that are new. So I was on the beneficial ownership panel earlier, and I talked a little bit about the rulemaking process we went through, a 5-year iterative rulemaking process. And that is consistent with the way we think rulemaking should be, which is thoughtful, which takes all of the issues into account, which listens to all of the key stakeholders in order to develop and ultimately help the private sector implement effective and efficient regulation. So I think the first thing is to say that that's not new. That's something we've always tried to do and will continue to do. I think the new part is all the things that we're talking about: innovation, technology, opportunity. Again, I get to work in an office where we always get to say, what's the opportunity? Why not? Why not try things? Why not think about things a little bit differently? Because we don't fit into a box. And so I think of a confluence of events: big data, innovation, discussions about cost of compliance, discussions about how effective is our system, how is it really working, putting all of those pieces together and saying, if we were going to design this system over again today, based on all of the information we have, what would it look like? And it starts really, therefore, getting into thinking very differently about, we have a risk-based approach system, but there are rules within that system, right? Whether there are thresholds in the context of SAR filing. And the question is, do those types of parameters work when you start applying AI to data and information? Those are the fundamental questions we're asking. And to do that and to help us answer those, we have been conducting outreach in the United States and outside the United States with legacy players, so large banks who have operated for a long time but are looking to innovate, applying innovation, but also looking to acquire, in some circumstances, new players, and sort of how they are working within their institutions. We are meeting with new entrants to the market. So as we all know, there's a lot of players entering the AML CFT space that don't fit into traditional financial institutions as we think of them. So what about that? How do those fit in? And then the last is vendors, technologists, looking and learning about AI What is it? How does it work? What's the application? And thinking of all those pieces, and then the really important piece for all of us is, well, and what does that mean in the context of our existing regulations? Do our existing regulations enable and support innovation? Are they going to support those new technologies? If we're going to apply AI to our systems, is that going to be okay? Is it okay if we file fewer SARs because we have a system that perhaps is identifying, fewer false positives? So these are the holistic group of things that we're talking about. And it is going to take some time. I'll refer back to Jim Richards on the first day, talked about sort of the development of the Patriot Act after 9/11, which was done very quickly, and perhaps too quickly, but it was a result of the environment we were in. I think we are, at this point, really rethinking about our regime as we did after 9/11. And I think from our perspective, it's incredibly important we take time to do that and do it thoughtfully so that it ends up being as effective as we want it to be. Just two other things I want to pick up on. I think everybody here knows, because a lot of individuals are not from the United States, this is a global discussion, right? This discussion is happening all over the world. Sandboxes, innovation, AI, how effective is our regime? Is our money being spent wisely? And that's happening in every country in the world that I know. It's happening in the Financial Action Task Force. We now have a standing agenda item at every FATF plenary dedicated to governments or private sector representatives talking about what they're doing, how they are increasing or enhancing innovation in their jurisdictions from a policymaker's perspective or from a private sector's perspective. And we're starting to grapple with a lot of these same issues. So I think it's really important and exciting that all of these discussions are going on. And the last thing that we think is really important, and this is something else we're doing, is as we think about what the next version of our universe looks like, what version 2.0 of our AML CFT regime looks like, we have to have a basis with which to define success. And in order to do that, we need to benchmark where we are today. We need to be able to say, just as Guillermo did, what is useful, right? What does that look like? What are the objectives? And there are quantitative and qualitative objectives that we can all come up with. And this is difficult, but we've never really done this. But I think from our perspective, it's important as we think about pilots and opportunities and technology to make sure that as we develop and implement new systems, we're comparing those outcomes with the outcomes we have today, and therefore benchmarking it to say, okay, this actually is more effective because of certain outcomes being better, and then there's the efficiency piece too. So this is all a work in progress, but we are doing a lot of exciting work, I think, at the department, but with all of you and everyone on this panel too. So we're learning together and really excited to continue this discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. And really captured a lot of the issues in the first organizing principle there. Just mindful of time, which is always, again, the enemy. Let's aggregate the first two topics here about BSA reform. What does it mean and current challenges? Why is there such interest in it now? I'm going to offer three thoughts and then just ask you guys to comment on and offer your views. The first is getting back to why we do this, the importance of the mission, and the increasing complexity and the expansion of that mission. As Ryan said, I mean, the evolution of this over time is astonishing, right? When you think about where this came from, which was originally tax and reporting, then looking at drug trafficking, right, as a predicate offense of money laundering, to all serious crime, to terrorist financing in the post-9/11 environment, anti-bribery and corruption, proliferation finance, all serious organized crime, the use of sanctions, the sophistication of sanctions from what used to be comprehensive jurisdictional trade bans to targeted measures against designated individuals and entities, to hybrid programs, where we're talking about screening systems and then due diligence on top of that, right? So the sophistication of the mission, the expansion of it, very clear. What might not be as clear is how important it has become. And this is fundamental to the points that everyone up here was making, which is why do we do this in the first place? And the key message that we've had for our clients, particularly in the boardroom, is to say, we know that this is hard, and it's getting harder. But in many ways, this is a function of our own success. We have found over time that the use of financial information and the use of financial disruption is pivotal in attacking the national and collective security threats that we face, whether it's terrorism, whether it's proliferation, whether it's rogue regimes, drug trafficking, or again, all serious organized crime. This has become an essential, not an optional, element of any comprehensive strategy to combat a collective security threat. And that is because of the success that we've had relying on industry to get to this point. That's fundamental. Second, that when we look at this mission, it is a function of our success, but it has to also encompass, when we talk about reform, all elements of what I call the counter-illicit finance regime. It's no longer AML. It's all illicit, right? With a very expansive view of what illicit looks like. And as we think about BSA and regulatory reform, the emphasis here is on preventive measures. But again, back to some of the comments up here, it's not just financial institutions, examiners, and supervisors. That's a focus of this conference, and we'll focus on that in our discussion. But it's worth reminding. It's also sanctions authorities. How many OFACs are there around the world? There's one. There's a problem with that, right? When you have Chapter 7 Security Council obligations to develop and implement targeted financial measures as a Chapter 7 requirement, every country needs to have one. How about financial investigations? We've talked about this. Do we really have the depth and the expertise in our law enforcement agencies to attack the kinds of sophisticated financial crime that you all see and report on? You know, these are real challenges all across, from supervision to investigation to information sharing to sanctions, et cetera. So the reform really has to think about the entirety of the mission, all the stakeholders that are implicated in that mission, and how across those stakeholders, responsibilities and roles can be leveraged so that we are maximizing our resources, right? Creating the efficiencies, enhancing the effectiveness, as Sarah was saying. So those are the thoughts that I would leave with respect to what we're doing and why there's an interest in the reform now. But let me ask you all to comment, and then we can move to objectives. What do you all think?
Maybe I could start just on this information sharing piece, because it's an important one for me. And there's something I think the current proposal doesn't do well enough. But I like to think of it this way as an analogy. I was also, in addition to working sanctions, I was an assistant U.S. attorney in the city of Chicago, which brings together the best elements of the most creative lawbreakers the world has ever known. And I learned a lot about how sophisticated money laundering organizations can be, particularly as they're being driven in some part outside of the financial system, and in particular in the city of Chicago. The Mexican drug cartel connections always came up with creative solutions to get money out of the United States. And something was very familiar to me, also having worked cyber cases, and I like to think of it in that context. When Google produces a product and they recognize that there's an exploitation in that product that allows for a cyber intruder to come in and steal information from a user, an individual user. When Google figures that out, what do? Do they keep that to themselves? Absolutely not. They shoot it out worldwide and share it with other tech companies to apprise them of that vulnerability, which are increasingly very difficult to detect and very, very creative, right? Because it's all about stealing money, mostly. At the end of the day, it's about stealing money. And financial institutions ought to be able to do that. If some slick compliance officer figures something out, the next sort of creative way that a particular criminal organization exploits the financial system, why don't they get to share that with all of their colleagues worldwide so that resources can be better spent identifying new threats, not individually each financial institution figuring out the same one? I think one of the biggest roadblocks that's not contemplated by this, and I saw it as a prosecutor, I see it even more in private practice, is the concern around data privacy, particularly outside of the United States, and the worry about sharing information that could be sensitive and could have implications in data privacy, sharing it outside of your own organization. And so I think when we talk about things like safe harbors, I worry, actually, this may not be very popular, but I worry a little bit less about implications from financial regulators, but having safe harbors that do exist in the US Privacy Act, safe harbors around the sharing of information so that that's not a roadblock to sharing among financial institutions these key matters, because I think we do, at least as I'm saying we again here, I don't work for the government anymore, but But we've had a lot of success, no question about it, but we need to take it to the next level. And I think the ability to work more closely together sort of is that next level. We're still focusing on the way that the enforcement arm is prioritized, mostly through these sanctions authorities, to get at illicit conduct of all stripes. I think sort of the ability to work together rather than individually in silos is just key.
For me, when I think of regulatory reform, I think it's using lessons learned to improve regulations, to improve the way the compliance program is designed, in addition to figuring out ways to get in front of the new money launderers. I totally agree with what was Ryan is saying about sharing of information. I mean, all too often, most of my sanctions cases that I prosecuted and AML cases that I prosecuted were global and were, at bottom, information that people had that they did not share or could not share. If you look, and Chip, you make a very good point about sort of it's all sort of one ball of wax. What is really clear to me now, and it's getting clearer, I think, is the notion that there's a unifying principle. It's no longer just AML, sanctions, anti-corruption. It's all together. It's all in one. And so are your compliance programs talking to each other? How are they talking to each other? And the new CDD rule has, I think, a line in it that discusses using the CIP information and using the information you get from your work in customer due diligence for all your programs, including OFAC. And that is very telling for me because, in my view, that that's guidance, and that's in the CFR, saying you need to look at it in one way, not suggesting that you have to address each one the same way, because they are different typologies, different techniques, but figuring out how you take all of those compliance pieces and put them together to help prevent bad actors from penetrating your bank or your financial institution.
Excellent. How about objectives? Let's pivot. Again, conscious of time here. Sarah, you mentioned effectiveness and efficiency. I hope there's no argument from others about those overarching objectives. How do we do that? What do you all think? You know, I recall a conversation in 2002 after the Patriot Act was adopted, and going back to the purposes of the BSA, right? The statute was amended to expand from produce information useful to law enforcement and tax authorities to also include counterterrorism authorities, regulatory authorities, the intelligence community. But the reality is that statutory definition does not match how we talk about the BSA, right? For a generation, we have used the language of protecting the integrity of the financial system. Point to that in the statute. It's not there, right? And so what does that actually mean? If we look at objectives and what are we trying to achieve with our programs, it's not just here's information for law enforcement, it's gone by, I can go back to whatever my inbox was. It's something else. If we're going to protect the integrity of the financial system, there has to be transparency, there has to be risk management, there has to be accountability. And how do you put those principles into practice? That's really what the objectives question seeks to answer. So anyway, what do we have up here?
So if I can just start on this. So when you say the we there, we've always said that our mission is protecting the integrity. That's not, as you said, the role of the BSA, and therefore that's not what financial institutions traditionally are examined against. They're not examined around how they've protected the international financial system from abuse. You guys are examined on the back of the specific BSA obligations. And so this is the longstanding question. Do these two missions, how do they come together? How do we make sure they come together? And so I think that's the first thing that I think we all have to recognize. And they shouldn't be in conflict, but I appreciate that, you know, within the department I get to protect the integrity of the international financial system. Certainly the private sector, I think you guys do both. You want to do both, so you do both. But from the BSA perspective and exam perspective, it's to align your program with their obligations. So that's just the first thing I'll say. I think the other is that I think the key term there in the BSA is useful. What is useful? And that's where I'm sort of getting to. I'm really interested in other folks on this panel. That's one of the things that we're grappling with. I think we really need to start getting to a place where we can say this is what useful is. and working our way, but I'll leave it at that.
Priorities and metrics, right? Priorities and metrics.
So the whole, I would say that the whole objective is to make these, first of all, I would say more global, right? We're still lacking of a global approach on several topics, foundational topics, information sharing, things of that nature. But let's say today we live in a world that, you know, I mean, this is an evolving target, right? And we live in a world in which you Google a pair of shoes, and then you're looking at your Facebook account and your shoes show up again, right?
That's right.
So they know that I was looking for those shoes, right? Yeah. Or I know the shoes that my wife was looking for yesterday with the same iPad, right? So, which is more concerning to me. But you know, but at the end of the day, I mean, if there's all this information, right, in several public sources, we still work on an isolated basis, right? It's unbelievable that all the firms for credit purposes, we use a FICO score, right? So you have a same score if you're getting a lease, a car lease, or if you're getting a credit card, right? But when I'm talking about risk rating yourself as a client, every single institution will use their own system. Every single institution will use their own methodology, right? And I think that we need to be thinking of something more global, more articulate, more of public, I would say, of getting more use of public information that is available out there. I still believe that we are in a very, you know, in the prehistoric era, trying to, you know, to periodically, you know, review our KYC files, right? And sending an email or calling a client and not being able to get a social security number, right? Or not being able to get a piece of paper. That again is just a tick the box process, because at the end of the day, you know, we understand that there's a part that is useful for law enforcement to be the source of information, but at the same time, is that really driving a difference in what we're doing, right? If we get more papers, I would say, you know, with all respect about the CDD beneficial owner, it's definitely a good step, but at the end of the day, the bad guys are not going to be hiding, right? The bad guys are going to use someone else. So we're truly expecting that through all this process of going to the prong, you know, two-leg individual, we're going to find out the names of the Mexican president? No, right? He's going to use someone. Or, well, I'm using Mexican president, but don't go that way. I still have my Mexican passport. So, you know, but what I'm saying is, like, we are still doing this process on a prehistorical era. Like, you know, the more information you get, the more you're going to be protected. Not really, right? You're going to be protected in case that you get in trouble and the regulators are going to come to you asking for the KYC file. But if your monitoring systems are useless, all that information is a piece of paper, right? So how can we make sure that on a more holistical approach, we need to sit down and think the objectives are, we need to be more effective, which means we need to be more assertive, if that's the case, or we need to be more, I would say, internationally oriented, right? Talking about, you know, tax evasion and things of that nature, all the countries will need to go. This goes from FATF, this goes from everyone in this stage. Everyone needs to have, you know, international tax evasion as a predicate offense, right? So just to have those specific areas that are, you know, all over the place, like, you know, it's not a criminal offense here, but it's a criminal offense here. But then the IRS is expecting you to tell them who are the bad guys evading taxes, right? But then when you go to SARS, you realize that that's not something that should be reported because it's not a transaction, right? Things of that nature that are still just very technical, that we need to sit down and look holistically at all the pillars of the process and thinking, are we doing the right thing? And of course, one element at the end would be, how can we convince the examiners that whatever the approach we're taking is going to be the right one, right? AI, you know, we all want to use more technology, more systems that will, you know, eliminate false alerts, but then I don't want my examiner coming to my shop saying, your machine, right, got rid of 19,000 alerts, right, because you consider they were useless. And actually, I just found one guy that was driving a pickup truck in the river in New York, right, that, you know, that, so show me what the guy was doing. And if that machine had 2 alerts, I'm going to be in trouble because I didn't look at them, right? So how can we change that mentality? And I would say it's the overall change that we need to think about.
Can I just talk about the usefulness for a point to both for Guillermo and Sarah? It was, I totally see what you're saying, especially when, and Sarah, I was talking to you a little bit about it earlier. Usefulness, what does usefulness mean? In the law enforcement context, when I put my government hat on, is how does it advance the ball in my investigation in a significant way? And what is that? So, for example, I'll make a long story very short. there was a fairly large money laundering scheme that we were investigating in the Eastern District of New York, Philadelphia, and LA. We had undercovers, we were going through tons of documents, and we kept hitting a wall on where the money was going. And I happened to reach out to a friend of mine, at FinCEN, who put me in touch with the FinCEN analyst who had been looking at BSA data, and in particular was focused on shell corporations, and was trying to figure out why all these shell corporations were bouncing money back and forth. So we went to meet, and it was in the Eastern District of New York, it was in Philly, and it was in LA. And I thought, oh my goodness, we might have something here. So we go visit FinCEN, and the analyst rolls out this ginormous links chart. It's links all these shell corporations together. And he walks us through 2 of them, and we realize that the owners of those shell corporations aren't who they say they are. They're some of the people our undercovers had been talking to that had been using J-1 visas holders as covers. We only knew that because of the SAR filings on the shell corporations and the fact that they were put together in a way that showed the connections. It was fantastic that we were able to see this, and that's a high degree of usefulness, in my view, is where you have, and that is not writing a SAR on, that is certainly not a defensive SAR, but it's certainly not writing a SAR on a small transaction or something that would not be useful to law enforcement.
Well, it's the feedback, right? The loop of feedback that you will need to receive from law enforcement to make sure that your SARs are useful, right? One of the key challenges that the compliance officers have is, like, let's say on these tax, evasion cases, right? You have someone that goes for a tax amnesty program, or someone that, a client will just reject the fact of giving you a certification that they are complying with their local tax obligations. So then you decide to close the account, or even the client just decides to close the account because they feel offended. And you file a SAR, but you don't know anything about it, right? Or if the client is still with you, you file a SAR, but you still work with them. You don't truly get, anything back saying this was useful, right? This is a consideration that the IRS or whatever law enforcement agency is taking. It's just a fact of, just report, because that way, if something goes wrong, we're protected. Which we need to move out of that mentality, right? What is really useful for catching the bad guys, I would say.
Yeah. So key topics that have come up in each of your comments. Information sharing technology, right? It's impossible to have a conversation about BSA Reg Reform without touching on those points. Let me ask for your views in dividing technology and information sharing into 2 sort of sets of objectives. One is to improve what we do now, right? So how do we report better? How do we do better due diligence? How do we investigate more effectively, et cetera? Another is to change potentially the architecture or the structure of roles and responsibilities and where things sit. Imagine a world, for example, where you have more straight-through processing and reporting by financial institutions who may not be in the best position to piece together all the transactions that identify a network like Clay's talking about, but putting more pressure on institutions to get high-quality data, because if the data is no good, nothing is going to work downstream. So financial institutions looking at CDD with paramount importance, making sure we've got current, accurate, complete reporting coming in that gives a lot more data over transactions, networks, and points of connectivity that are difficult, if not impossible, for individual financial institutions to identify by themselves. And whether it's to make us better at what we currently do or to create something maybe a little bit different, should these be additive or should these be alternatives? Those are tough questions in which information sharing and technology has been at the center of those sorts of debates. So let me ask for your views on those 2 issues. Okay. We rehearsed all this. This was all rehearsed.
I'll go first. I think you're right. So the interesting thing about information sharing is that in the U.S., our regulatory framework has, put 314A and 314B in place with the Patriot Act. And what's really interesting, as we've been, so information sharing, and Nick Maxwell's here this week, and this has been a topic of a couple of different panels and discussions in the private sector dialogue on Monday. This is I call it, and I don't mean it to diminish it, but it's a bit of the flavor of the month, public-private partnerships and information sharing. And for good reason. But I think the US is an interesting country because I think that's something that we recognize. In fact, that was really the whole purpose of, in some ways, the creation of TFI and appreciating the importance of financial information and the role that the private sector plays. So I think we're in a unique position. But at the same time, what we've learned is that it's not as effective as it should be. And so there's been a lot of discussions in the US, particularly around 314B, about enhancing those tools. And that's what all of these issues have to do with. It's about how you think about, and it's just as Chip said, you've got models that are looking at data pooling, which, and I think the key thing is what the objectives are. Some types of information sharing have to do with sort of threat-driven and target-driven identification. Other have to do with systemic identification, typologies. So I think, and it depends then at what data set you're looking at. But I think this is a really interesting discussion globally because there has been a lot done. A number of jurisdictions have started to change their legal framework associated with information sharing to allow more of this because there's been a greater acceptance and recognition globally, particularly in Europe after the Paris tax initially, about the importance of this type of communication. The one thing I'll put that is really interesting is that we found is that the 314B authority is the one that's truly unique. We are really struggling with other jurisdictions having the ability for their domestic institutions to share information amongst themselves to eventually have a broader discussion with the government. And just in terms of roles and responsibilities, I think there's a lot of discussion about the tipping point. Who's got this? Is it always on the private sector to do all the analysis? Should there be a greater role for government to do this? I think trying to find a balance. I think these are exactly the types of things in the context of reg reform that we're trying to figure out.
Excellent. We're inside 20, so I'm going to go to you all in the audience for questions. There's a lot on the table here. I thought this was a microphone, but it's a hammer. I'm not sure who I'm supposed to hit. But don't be afraid. It's actually plastic. So who's got questions for us? We've got a couple microphones here, I think. Thank you very much. Back here. And I need some hands. Who's got a question for us? I warned you. I said don't fall asleep. We're coming back to you. What do we got? Okay, well, we have a question here from David.
Don't glare at me.
Flavor of the month.
Oh, God.
Now, I couldn't let that go. How can you say it's in whose eye is it the flavor of the month? How can you just dismiss it so easily?
No, that's what I was saying. I used the wrong term. I didn't mean to suggest it wasn't important. It's just incredibly popular. Everywhere I go, there's a new initiative. There's a new, and the important thing is all these models are different, and I think they get conflated a lot. And so I tried to preface that by saying I didn't mean to diminish the importance. I think we think it's exactly the right thing to do, but there's just a lot. Every time somebody, I'd say on a daily basis, I have somebody coming to me and saying something about public-private and information sharing, and then I have to sort of dissect it to understand what it is, anyway. So I'm sorry, David.
Aren't we in the perfect?
Can I just say, in Sarah's defense,
Figures here. Here we go.
Yeah, I know.
I
never left. I never left the office.
I can see that.
But we hear it all the time too, right? Even out in private practice, public-private partnerships, pilots, sandboxes, right? My biggest frustration sits with industry and government in getting past the concept. Like, let's put some of these balls in play. It's nice to talk about public-private sector partnerships. It's nice to talk about sandboxes and pilots. How many do we have up and running right now? Who's in a pilot? Whose institution has invested in a sandbox? Which regulators have authorized certain sandboxes to go? I mean, we've got to get out of the starting box, right? We've actually got to put these ideas into practice. And I think that's probably why it gets frustrating, because it sounds great, but we've got to do these things, right?
Right, and so what we need, and it was your last point, and it's coming, is that we don't get them to step in the sandbox. you know, if we hear, and I know you didn't mean it the way it came out, but I figured it was a great open door, is that we hear that. And we hear, yes, we're interested in it, we're talking about it, we're going around the world, and we're holding dialogues in the Caribbean and Latin America and the Middle East, and we're talking. And I think we've had the same conversation for the last 5 years. We're talking. We're ready. As an industry, we're ready. We want you to step in the sandbox with us, but we can't get you to do it.
Well, I actually don't think that's quite right, David. So to a certain extent, this is already happening, and Andrea alluded this too. We are regularly talking to different players that are talking about pilots, and that's what I was saying, initiatives and others. We are there listening and they're ready. But we haven't yet reached a place collectively, and this is what Chip is saying, is that I think people aren't yet clear what we're asking for, like what they're asking for. But just so you understand, those discussions go on in a tremendous amount of detail about things that, you know, we in government may need to do, or what questions for them about how they're working, but they haven't actually collectively matured enough to get to a place that somebody's ready to push play on one of these pilots.
And can I just follow up on that? Because the notion sometimes that regulatory reform is, I mean, I've heard it, that means cutting costs only, cutting compliance officers. And so when folks come to the government, or when I'm talking with clients about machine learning and that sort of thing, I say it's a way to enhance your program. It's a way to make your program better. It's a way to help deploy the people you already have in a better place, to maybe help with sanctions or AML or ABC corruption. And I think a lot of times there is this view that when you go to the government and you say, I want to talk about regulatory reform, it's about, you know, the bottom line. And I think that's how you message and what your intentions are. And folks are more likely to be open if you're looking to enhance your program versus firing people after you've been able to eliminate 20,000 false alerts.
Claire, I think we still have some more detoxing to do for you. You're like Chip. You're like Chip. So now we're outnumbered here. We have 1, 2, 3 against 2.
It's a 5-year plan.
He was shaking his head, so I appreciate
there have
that.
to be questions out there. Don't be afraid. You can see it's not a problem. They're very friendly.
We like the tough questions. Who's got
they
one?
do.
Yeah, I used to try cases.
Nobody.
I'm ready.
Are there any on here? Did anybody send any through the app? Yes? No? Of course, if you say yes, then we know who you are. Okay. I'll see if there's anything on here.
I'll be provocative with the panel here. Why aren't we further along with the pilots? What I've seen, and maybe this is something that is familiar to you, or maybe you've got a different read on it, is from an industry perspective, there has to be an acceptance that you don't get a timeout to experiment. And I'm sort of wearing a government hat here, David, but to say, well, as we do to our clients, which we push to innovate, that when you innovate, you can't turn off what you're doing now to see if you can do something else better. You need to maintain the program, the systems, the controls, the policies that you have, and then you need to build labs, and then you need to do comparative analysis. And what's interesting about that approach is that it allows us to get to metrics without understanding absolutes, right? Because absolutes and counterfactuals are impossible in this business. But you can understand comparative effectiveness, right? So if you've got a set of systems and controls and monitoring over transactions in one data set, and you want to drop a new tool in AI, machine learning, et cetera, then you're going to have to run these in parallel tracks, do the analysis, and demonstrate that track 2 is more effective than track 1 to yourself, to your regulator, and then you can start to turn track 1 off and roll out track 2. But the notion that we're going to be able to create sandboxes or labs, and therefore we get a pass on track 1 while we're figuring it out, no, that's not going to happen. And I'm simplifying it, but not by much. I still don't see the industry in a position where they're willing to do track 1 and track 2. Now I'll flip it. On the government side, where we've had sophisticated discussions along these lines with financial institutions that have clearly tried to internalize this, the question from them becomes, what's my guarantee if I build a track 2? Not that it's going to be more effective, but that whatever I build in track 2 isn't going to be a liability for me. that if I start reporting more information that demonstrates effectiveness, i.e., look, there's more bad guys in track 2. With this monitoring system, I'm finding all kinds of good stuff. Is that going to come back to me now that I've got better reporting on more bad guys? Am I going to have regulators and law enforcement circle back and say, well, why did you open that account? And what happened over here? So you get punished effectively for being innovative, right? And so I think between those two sort of simplified stories, there's work to do in both places, industry and government, to provide legal certainty and incentives for these pilots, if you're the government, and for financial institutions to really invest in these labs, understanding that you don't get to turn off what you're doing now while you invest. What do you all think? Is that a question?
Nope.
I agree 100%.
No, that sounded like
It's not a question.
it sounded like something right out of the Treasury Department. And I can only say that because I've had that conversation recently. And that was exactly the issue, was you can't turn off track 1 while you're working on track 2. So we're going to duplicate the amount of effort that we're making. We're going to duplicate the cost that it takes to run both track 1 and track 2. No bank's going to do that at this point, because at the end of the day, and this is something that always gets put out there, you guys are in the business to make money, right? I mean, you have shareholders to report to and boards of directors that expect to see some type of profitability out of what you do. So if I'm going to do track 1, track 2, so we had recommended, we said, okay, how about we just take one little piece? And here's where we jump in together, okay, into that, whatever you want to call it, litter box, sandbox, I really don't care. And we try it, 6 months or whatever period it is. If it works, we keep going. If it doesn't work, we have to turn back on track 1 because track 2 didn't work. And Sarah, go ahead.
But how do we know it works, David? How do we know it works? What does that mean, it works?
Then we'll never know anything works.
No, but this is my point about the metrics. I think what you're saying makes sense if we have a basis with which to define what works means. And it's really hard then to just say, and it's regardless of which model, if you have 2 tracks going together or not, but you've got to, so you know.
Okay, well, thank you for that. How do we know what currently is going on works?
That's what I'm
Because
telling
we
you.
keep asking,
Yep.
you know, is it working? I think on the very first panel of the conference, and even in the public-private sector dialogue, and I don't want to point at anybody, somebody brought up the point that we have invested a lot of time, a lot of resources over the years, and what exactly are the results? Have we really stopped the bad guys? Or are they still out there doing what they've been doing? They're just doing it in a different way.
So this is what we're looking to do within the department now. We're trying to define what, that's one of the things that we're looking at.
And banks are doing it, by the way.
And
I don't know. I know for a fact banks are doing it. I'm not going to say who they are because they don't want me to say who they are. But I know that they're doing it. And so the idea that no bank will do it, I just don't think.
I didn't say no bank will do it.
That's what I thought I heard you say.
Well, this isn't taped, right? No, the issue is that, yes, there are, and we had this, I actually had this conversation with Ken Blanco. There are some banks that have the purchasing power to be able to do it. The majority don't. So while Bank A there on the end of the panel may have the resources, there are many banks out here that don't. So if we never try, if we spend the next 20 years defining the metrics of how we measure success, it's not going to be, it's not static. That's always changing. And we have a question up here in the front. Sorry. I saw Sarah getting ready.
The answer that you gave to David's question about, you know, how have we, what is the measure of what has been done for the past few years? And basically, with all due respect, your lack of an answer scares the heck out of me. Because then I raise the question, how much good money have we thrown away for, if I go black and white, for what? If you're not capable of telling us what we have achieved, we have thrown away a lot of good accounts, a lot of good money, for what?
So I'll take the first answer to that, and I'll let you guys answer. I think it's a great question. You know, it gets back to whether what we're doing matters. I will tell you, Here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to cure the human condition. I've said that before, but it's worth repeating. We are not going to make bad guys go away. People are they're going to cheat, they're going to lie, they're going to steal, they're going to sell drugs, they're going to commit fraud. This is the human condition, right? What we are going to do is make it harder, costlier, riskier for them to do it in our bank, in our financial system. And if they do it, we're going to try to catch them, right? I mean, we have to get real about what the metrics are ultimately here. Harder, costlier, riskier. Second, when you look at the understandable frustration about, well, we don't really have certainty over these things. There is a relative sense of progress that is very clear across whether it's episodic stories about Al-Qaeda or Iran or the drug trafficking network that was just indicted in San Diego last week, a pretty big network that went down. You can point to cases and look at these cases and say, these things don't happen. Iran doesn't come to the table. Al-Qaeda is not balkanized if we aren't doing what we're doing in this room. So there should be no doubt that what we're doing is episodically essential when we look at specific networks or threats. The tougher question, it's a fair one, is systemically, what does this mean? Have we really tilted the balance in the human condition? Wrong metric. Have we made it harder, costlier, riskier? Yeah, but how much, and how do we do that more effectively, right? So I just want to give you a reason for optimism, because it is frustrating, right? And counterfactuals are impossible to prove. But there is no question where we are progressing, and we're now at a point in the conversation where, to Dave's point, this is 5 years old, but it's more advanced than it's ever been. And I do feel like we're on the cusp of breakthroughs. Take the smaller financial institutions and build consortia, right? To your point, David, a smaller bank isn't going to have the data that a UBS or HSBC is going to have to run these sorts of pilots. But if 6 community banks got together in a consortium and started doing a 314B, there's an option, right? To your point, how about putting a HIFCA in with that and have them do it together? So there's ideas, but it's going to take leadership to get us over the hump.
Yeah, I mean, on this question of, I can't sort of reinforce what Chip is saying enough in terms of the effectiveness of what you're doing. I mean, again, as a guy who spent more than a decade fighting mostly Iran, proliferation networks, and terrorist financing, there's no question that Iran would have never come to the table. We wouldn't be where we are with North Korea and the like had it not been for the efforts of compliance officers at financial institutions wanting to do the right thing. It's absolutely effective. There's no question. And in fact, that's reflected in U.S. policy now that we're going to use, as we've said before, the sanctions authorities for whatever type of criminal law you want to enforce outside the United States. Is going to be the primary vehicle. What I think is going to force the innovation that you're talking about and force the so-called private-public partnerships, I still think the pendulum's going to sweep back, to go back to my original thing. It's technology, not technology to detect wrongdoing, but technology that increasingly wants to move money in anonymous ways. It's going to require everyone to think at a higher level about the way you do compliance, and the government is going to be forced, because some criminal conduct is going to take advantage of it, to work with you all on those technologies. Second, I think, again, I want to come back to the point, the effect of, in fact, the enforcement arm has been so effective, it has cut entire countries out of the US system. I have countries, through partnerships we have, coming to my law firm and saying, can you or someone help convince a correspondent, a relationship in New York to deal with us? I mean, cutting off entire countries from the US financial market, and therefore the global market, because of de-risking at that point in the use of the US dollar. And so at some point, again, something bad's going to happen, and diplomatic efforts, I think, will probably take over and force the government and banks to try to address these very serious risks, because you can't push people back into agrarian societies. You have to build economies in faraway places if you want to avoid some of the unfortunate effects of terrorist recruitment and the like.
On the exclusion piece, and Sarah, I'm going to ask you to respond to this because I know you've done a lot of work on it. I will say we've seen certainly exiting across the industry, but it's definitely more, in my view, sort of fact and circumstance driven. What I think is going to be interesting, and the question I have is, when does the market fill it, right? Because if you're looking for a high-risk jurisdiction, and we do business in high-risk jurisdictions, our clients are in high-risk jurisdictions, and the real question isn't, this is high risk or is it not high risk, it's can you develop the risk management systems that can address those concerns? And what that really requires is maybe banks that look at a business decision and say, this market doesn't make sense for me, right? Because it's cents on the dollar for me to stay in Kyrgyzstan, and it's not worth me investing in understanding how Kyrgyzstan works as an economy to maintain an affiliate relationship or a correspondent. I'm out. But there may be a Kyrgyzstan community that wants to build a Kyrgyzstan bank and fills that void, right? So a lot of this is the market just taking time to settle. As there are exits, there are going to be new entrants. It doesn't happen overnight, right? And market settlement is messy. But I think a lot of this is just focusing on risk management, who can backfill in ways that make business sense. And part of that is just investing in the risk management.
But it's a two-way concept, right? It's a two-way road, I would say, right? I don't think that it's just the regulators the ones that need to trigger to pull the trigger and start this discussion. I think it's just, both sides. Definitely there are foundational items that, that regulators might need to address, right? I mean, I still struggle that we look, if we look at conservative to our monitoring models, right? The things that we're trying to identify through our systems are still, very archaic, right? We're thinking about round number wires, right? Yeah. Sequential traveler checks. I mean, guys, really? Right? So those foundational items, I think that those need to be addressed from a regulatory policy perspective, I think. But however, the players on the other side, which is the industry, I would say that we need to step up and show that innovation is something feasible and something that, I would say that the UAT that you're considering, this purpose of having a parallel, system running with the other one, is the normal way that we follow, when we implement a new monitoring system, right? Yeah. You never turn down something and you just turn on the other one.
You gotta test it.
You'll have something testing and you will, recognize the value, and then you would say, now that we see that, the results are good, right? Can we turn this one off? Now, it's difficult, of course, on the other side to be a compliance officer and just go to my board and talk to them about innovation, right? They're going to be questioning about managing risk and costs, not innovation. So if I just walk to them saying I need $10 million because I want to be, the innovation firm in the industry, they're going to laugh at me, right? And they're going to say, what is required by the law? And I'm going to say, well, no, nothing regarding innovation. Yeah. Right? So that's the tricky point of this equation, I think.
Absolutely. Let me ask you guys for a 30-second wrap-up. We're out of clock, but I want to give you guys a chance to offer a recommendation or two in a wrap-up, and then we'll move over to the next panel. Guillermo, go ahead. We'll go right down the line.
I would say work together, industry and governments, to figure out this problem and stay away from stereotypes. I would say that the most critical aspect that has been impacting the correspondent banking space and some other industries has been one single case from law enforcement, right? And then we try to paint the world with the same brush, saying, bad guys from Mexico, let's say in Chicago, right? They send the money in wire, number wires, right? And then we just try and say, okay, everything that is, round number wires needs to be escalated. Things of that nature, that we need to truly think about how money is laundered, how really money got into the hands of the terrorist financing, right? And how can we prevent that situation?
Facts and circumstances matter, absolutely. Sarah.
So picking up on what Guillermo was saying, work together, so with your industry partners, with government stakeholders, but as you work through and think about applying innovation, identify what the problems are that need to be fixed, and whether that's within your systems or within the regulatory systems, and communicate that to us, right? Because I think that's the fundamental question is the system inhibiting innovation or not? And if it is, how is it doing that? Help us identify what those barriers are, and please communicate them to us.
Technology is here. We're going to all have to figure out how to deal with it. We can deal with it in the positive by taking it head on and figuring out how to use it to benefit our compliance programs. And I think that, like I said at the very beginning, having that hunger to keep up with the way things are changing will help you weather any storm.
I would just reinforce the earlier point I was making around information sharing and the value of that and how resource saving it could be, as well as on the topic of resourcing. I think the government needs to do a better job funding the capabilities of the Treasury Department that again, I mean, I can't say enough good things about, and both OFAC and FinCEN, and sort of trying to do the right thing by industry, but having the capability to actually get done and implement all their good ideas.
Excellent. My recommendation is simply learn from one another. Support FIBA. Support David. Support this conference. These are the events, and I'm sort of joking, but I'm sort of not. We can't afford to discount or disregard the lessons or the experiences that you get in your institutions when you come to these conferences. We need more of these conferences. We need more time sharing what works and what doesn't work. We have 10,000 labs in the United States. They're called banks, right? So let's learn what's working in each of these banks. Let's not rely on regulators to have to examine and say this one works better than that. We can talk to each other too. These events are crucial if we're going to get out in front of this. So just want a big plug for David and the conference and for you all for coming here. And again, next year, a week. That's my recommendation.
A week.